Okay, and let me start by asking, is the screen that you see, is it the one that shows research methods? Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Again, I'm Randy Kearns, your professor, and today we want to talk about research methods. But before we do, let me talk just a little bit about the assignment last week and the week before. So the week before the assignment was the literature review. I asked for either your whole lit review or the first 5 pages. And I think in doing so, I hadn't done a good job of being clear about how long the literature review should be. And so, and that became more clear as I talked with several of you this week who felt a little bit lost about some of what was due both last week and this coming week. So a couple of things. First of all, I've tried to go back into the assignment windows to clearly specify how large the introduction should be, how large the literature review should be. The method section is actually fairly small, but it's very important because this is where we talk about finding a source for data. And then section 4 or chapter 4 is really the results. What method did you use? And so our chapter 3 is our methods, chapter 4 is our results. And the results also include discussion about the results and what are the limitations. And then chapter 5 is really just a conclusion. It's typically no more than 1 or 2 paragraphs. It basically says, yeah, this is what this is what I found in my research. And then there's some other pieces that we need to go back in and put in: title page, abstract, references, things like that. But that's just finalizing the paper. The most important piece really gets back to the literature review, because that offers anybody else reading your work what type of insight you have and what type of research you did to try and find more of the background of the topic that you chose. And I mentioned to several of you along the way that the topic that you choose will become more narrow and more focused as you get to the point where you're ready to write your chapter 1, your introduction and background, and certainly as it relates to developing your research methods. And so that's why I say, as far as deadlines coming up, if you haven't noticed, if you'll look in Moodle, I've changed the deadline for lit review and introduction. It was due last Sunday night, I think the 11th. I've changed that to Sunday night, the 18th. And what I'm doing right now, as I'm going through and grading these, if they're too small, I'm just rejecting the entire thing and sending it back to you so that you can add some more content to it. The point is this: first of all, you have to have 15 peer-reviewed articles. If you don't have 15 peer-reviewed articles, you can't really finish your lit review. So if somewhere along the way you submitted a couple of articles that I said, these are good sources, but they don't qualify as peer-reviewed articles, you need to go find 2 more peer-reviewed articles. If I rejected 2 of them, you need 15 peer-reviewed articles, as well as any other sources you want to add, but all of that goes into your lit review. Now, when I talk about the annotated bibliographies, Again, you did one annotated bibliography for each of your 15 peer-reviewed articles. Well, in most every case, most of you have anywhere between 20 and 26 to 28 pages worth of content. And if you'll go back into that content, you can really pick and choose some of the description that you used and weave that together with other articles now that are similar or different or offer a timeline, again, depending on how you set up your lit review. But you can use some of the content from your annotated bibliography in your lit review. And so I really don't think it's a monumental task to to write a sizable lit review given what you've already written, and it's really just taking that information and reworking it or weaving it together. And then the introduction and background is really where your paper needs to come into focus. And I've had this discussion with several of you now about you had some I've read a number of really good research topics, but they're really broad, and starting this week, we've got to narrow them down. And that's because our methods include finding the data that's out there to help us make our point or to help us understand our point. And so this week, we need to identify where that information is. Well, again, in talking with several of you, I really got the feeling that more than a few of you felt a bit overwhelmed. And in looking at where we are in the timeline for completing this class, we had kind of a soft week in there anyway. So I'll encourage you to do this. First of all, once you get my feedback on your chapter 1 and chapter 2, if it's clean and you're in good shape, I urge you to move forward and go ahead and work on your methods this week. I did push back the due date for the methods section to next week. I think the 25th, April the 25th, and then the results, limitation, discussion, and conclusion will be due the following week. But again, I would encourage you, if you're caught up, stay caught up. If you're behind, I'm giving you an extra week to allow you to get your work done without falling too much further behind. Anyway, I hope that makes sense. Again, just to be sure that we're all clear about this, there are 5 pieces to this paper that are big pieces, and then there are other supplemental parts. But those 5 pieces typically come out to about 25 pages. I've seen some of them. I think it's reasonable to come in under 25 pages, but not far under 25 pages. I think the range that I offered was 20 to 25 for your finished paper. And when I talk about 25 pages, I'm not including the title page. I'm not including the table of contents. I'm not including the abstract, and I'm not including the references. When I talk about 20 to 25 pages, I'm talking about chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, and chapter 5. Okay. Anyway, I hope that's clear. But again, if I've said something that's confusing, or if you still feel lost about some of this, please let me know. And so let me get into the method section tonight, and let's talk about kind of what our next steps are in developing, again, our research project that, to some extent is really about the structure of building a research paper. I also tried to give you an idea of what you'll face in your future if academically you want to pursue a master's degree. I hope, the University of New Orleans does not require a bachelor's thesis. Some schools do, but if we required a bachelor's thesis, it would be about twice the size of this paper. But more than anything else, I hope this paper at least gave you a lot of a much better feel for what the research process is and how to write and compose a work of research as it relates to looking at a topic and carrying it through from starting the research to finishing it and delivering a reasonable paper that's a part of that process. So as far as our presentation for tonight, again, the focus tonight I want to be sure and talk about is chapter 3, the methods. And again, when we talk about the methods, we're really looking at specifically where's the data. The best way to think about the methods section is if I use a mapping software to drive from point A to point B, and I actually look in the details, it will tell me each step of the way that I need to turn left and drive this distance and turn right and drive this distance. And the whole point to a methods section is to allow people to come behind you later and repeat your work. And the reason you want people to repeat your work is to confirm your findings. Remember when we went over Andrew Wakefield and some of his what turned out to be rather outlandish claims about vaccines? It was only because his methods section in his research was rather ambiguous, and so it required people to work a little bit harder to try and repeat his work. But once they figured out exactly what he was trying to do, they realized what he didn't do, and they also realized he had faked his data. And again, that's the whole point about the scientific process, is we want to confirm what we have, and sometimes replicating work helps us understand more of the nuances, more of the details about replicating that work. But the whole point about the methods section is to tell somebody that step-by-step piece and how to get there. Again, it talks about how we collected data. In our case, we're only using secondary data. So to use secondary data, we'll be looking at websites like the Census Bureau, the Louisiana Department of Health, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. There's lots of repositories of data out there. So if you're having any trouble with data sources, let me know. But it can start with a Google search. Just understand Google can't always find data that's not always stored on the World Wide Web, and government databases aren't always searched under the World Wide Web. They're compartmentalized and a little bit more difficult to find, but they're out there. And again, if you have trouble, just let me know. Again, the whole point to the methods section is to help the reader understand how you collected the data, how you analyze the data, and again, the whole point to a methods section in detail is to allow people coming behind you to replicate what you did. If there were people involved in the study, it talks about the participants. Again, we're going to use secondary data. We're going to use data that somebody else collected for a different reason, but it's good information and it'll help us make our case as well. The procedure, what happened along the way to allow you to collect the data. If you want to talk about how the data were originally collected, then that's also good. Measures, what type of measures are you using, or what type of survey, or what type of data analysis are you doing? Again, we're not doing substantial statistical analysis. We want to do more of a fundamental understanding of the data that we found and what direction does it point us in. And I've mentioned this before, but again, just think about GPS mapping software helping you take step by step on how to get from point A to point B. It is important to talk about where you found the data. That will probably be another reference in your paper. More than likely, you've not included data sources so far in your lit review, and even if you did, most data sources are not peer reviewed. So chances are you're going to find data at a place that's not peer reviewed. And so this will be an additional source in your references. It won't be necessary to include this in your lit review, but it will be necessary to include it in your method section. You need to also talk about the order and how things occurred in terms of what you did and how you found it, and then how you took the information and how you analyzed it. If you recruited the sample, in most cases, you're going to find it by an internet search. If you're a part of a team, then it's also important to identify who collected the data. In your particular case, if you're analyzing secondary data, it's important to report who originally collected the data, and then you found it on this website, if that's available. Again, the processes, how did the study evolve? What activities were involved, and are there any other important details that will help your reader understand the process you went through to write the method section of your paper. Participant section, and in other words, if you have samples that were, if you have a sample population that was recruited, in most cases that's not going to be the case unless you're reporting on the findings of another study that's out there. And that's okay. So let's say you found a paper that was written at Tulane that you want to use an element of their data to make your point. In that particular case, you can talk about how they collected their sample, how they recruited it, how they analyzed it, and then how you pull that information into your work and how you used it. But in most cases, the procedure section for secondary data from a place like the Department of Health is really going to be a matter of, I found it on this website on the Department of Health, and this is what it meant to me. And same thing I just mentioned, really. In terms of a sample, sometimes if we do a sample collection, we're more likely to do a convenient sample. We're going to sample people that are more convenient to us. If you have any difficulty understanding sampling, if you'll go back to the original presentation that we did the first 2 weeks that covers the basics of research, that will help you identify what approach that you want to take for your analysis. But in most cases, it's going to be either some type of historical or well, I'm getting ahead of myself. Hang on. I'm sorry. Sometimes I start skipping to slides that are coming up in front of us. Let's kind of move on. Again, how was the sample recruited? In most cases, you're going to be talking about either what was in a paper where you found the data, or what was on the website where you found those data. Again, is it related to the Department of Health, whether it's the Louisiana Department of Health or the Mississippi Department of Health? I can tell you firsthand, both of those have substantial databases available that can help you with most any problem that you're looking for that has a certain health element to it. CDC certainly has a substantial amount of information available as well. Sometimes it's a little bit more difficult to sort through the CDC data, but those data are out there. It's really just a matter of us finding it. This kind of gets into recruiting samples. Again, we're really not going to be recruiting samples for this work. I've included it, and it's an important part of the research methods, but it's probably not going to be most of what you're going to wind up doing. This is just another example of recruiting samples. How did you find it? How did you find participants in the sample? And then how did you make contact with them? Who collected the data, again, gets back to more of a group effort. In most cases, if it's a single researcher, you just want to report that you collected the data. If you have research assistants that were involved, you may not necessarily identify them by name, but again, it depends on how many authors are on the paper. For our work, one author, one paper, and it's probably you collecting all of the information and doing all of the analysis. So it's not really necessary to go into those details for this work. Again, just a little bit more background into who collected the data. Again, just another example of that. It is important, again, if you're doing primary data, it's important to also identify where you collected those data. Even from a secondary data standpoint, it's going to be important for you to identify where you found those data. And that's, again, most likely going to be a website, particularly as close as we are to the end of the semester. We don't have the time to get involved in designing a survey instrument and doing primary data analysis. We need to look for existing data that's already been collected, and there's plenty of it there that can help us make whatever point we want to make, or at least help you understand what is accurate and what is truthful about a point that you're interested in knowing more about. Where did the activities take place? This gets into, again, if we're doing primary data, was there participants involved in the activities? Since that's not the case, or if it is because you're reporting secondary data from people who were involved in a treatment or a therapy, it would be important to describe that. And I'm talking about information that's from the research that was done and the paper that you're citing where you're finding some of your data. In some cases, it may be reasonable to pull data from a couple of papers and maybe a website. And so if you're doing that and you're creating kind of a collection of information as it relates to, you know, we found a couple of papers from research that was done by some agency in New Orleans, and then we found some information on the Louisiana Department of Health, and how did you either blend the two together, or how did they either complement each other or conflict with each other? And other parts about processes and activities, again, this gets into what were the steps that you took along the way to collect the data, and how did you do that? And then any other important details. I will tell you, in some cases, there's financial incentive for people to participate in the vast majority of research. That's not there, but if it is there, it does need to be disclosed. If you're involved in a significant data research project later on, again, if there's money involved, or if there's any incentive at all offered to participants, you need to identify that in your research. So the biggest challenge is that level of detail. Again, it gets back to, you really need kind of a list of how you acquired the information, and then what did you do to analyze the information. You're not going to report the results there. You're going to report the results in Chapter 4, the results section. But the methods should help us understand the step-by-step process you took to get to the results. Again, I hope that makes sense. And again, the GPS approach. So again, it's important to write as you go. Try not to wait until you're done. Um, and at this point, I really need to wrap up with a couple of things. Obviously, tonight's going to be a somewhat short night, but I do need to be clear about where we are in the paper. The whole point to this exercise is to help you understand research as a process. It's so that if at some point in your career, whether your career takes you further into academia or it takes you immediately in the real world, if you need to find scientific information, where do you find it? And I hope by now you've come to understand the difference between trade journals like ProPublica or and potentially good sources like NPR and the New York Times and the Washington Post. Those types of news organizations can help you establish a timeline. Just understand they're not peer-reviewed scientific journals. So the science is found in the peer-reviewed scientific journals. And so the cornerstone of good research has to be built around that. And that's why I've kind of hammered you on those 15 peer-reviewed articles that has to be the basis for your research. But as you move forward, what are other pieces that you need? You know, the New York Times article or a ProPublica article or an NPR article or a Kaiser Permanente website. All of those are good places to help you find data or to help you find information. They're just not peer reviewed. And so as far as data goes, again, the data on, so whether you're using the Kaiser Foundation data, and there's actually a lot of hospital information on the Kaiser Foundation data. Robert Wood Johnson is another foundation that has a substantial amount of healthcare data. The Louisiana Department of Health, the Mississippi Department of Health, both of them have substantial amounts of data on their website. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has a substantial amount of data on its website. So there's lots of data that's out there, but those are not peer-reviewed sources. So again, it's important for us to recognize in chapter 1, you can use a timeline that starts with an article from the New York Times. It's okay. It's another source. In chapter 2, your lit review must include your peer-reviewed 15 articles. In chapter 3, your methods section, you'll talk about where you got your data, and you'll talk about what steps you went through to help use your data to help you understand the size and the scope of the problem. You know, there are people right now that are talking about the very low case count in influenza, and compared to 2020, where case counts were also very low, and 2019, when case counts were very high, it does beg the question, you know, are some of the influenza numbers being confused with COVID numbers? And because I'm well aware of the clinical testing that goes on, I can confidently say that the reason the flu numbers are down as much as they are really has to do with the public health measures that we've taken to try and prevent the spread of COVID. But you have to look at those data to help you understand that those numbers are down. And then when you see those numbers trending down as dramatically as they have, then a part of that is how you report that in the results. And then you've got some discussion after the results to help people understand. The only piece the methods will do is to say, I found these data, and this is where I found them. I analyzed them over 3 years or 5 years, and you know, and these are the steps that I took to analyze them. It's in chapter 4 that you'll report the results, and this is what I found. So again, the methods tell your reader where you found the information, and that's why the method section can literally be 1 to no more than 3 pages, but I've seen very good method sections take no more than a page, because all you're doing is describing where you found the information and what process you use to analyze the information, and if there's any specific details, again, to help your reader understand how they could replicate what you did. Anyway, I hope that's been helpful tonight. Let's kind of wrap up with just a couple of things. Again, I realize we're finishing kind of early, and I do want to get a better feel for where we are later on this week based on your feedback before we talk about assignments for next week. Next week, I still want to go forward with results and conclusion, but I also want to give you the time and the space you need to get caught up and to not feel like you're being left behind, or not to feel like you're overwhelmed at the moment. So,
I have a question. So how we were talking about like the data and everything in your 15 annotated bibliographies, like they have to be included in the literature review.
right.
Can you still like include data from like the CDC? Okay, never mind. This is my question. Okay, so there was a report that's like was published for like Louisiana's maternal mortality rate in like 2017.
Right.
It's basically like, it's like what we're doing. It tells you the methods and everything else. But I didn't put that in my annotated bibliography, but I do have to swap out one of the sources. So can I just do that and then use it? Because like that would be secondary or peer reviewed.
So long as it's peer reviewed, you can include that in your literature review. Regardless, okay, you can use it in your methods, and regardless, you want to include it as a source, but you may or may not have to include it in your lit review. It does need to be peer reviewed if it's going to appear in your lit review.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Are there other questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure.
How you said for the chapter 1 and 2, that's due on the 18th. Are you going to reopen it on Moodle?
So I have reopened it now, and I'm going through now. And if you sent me something as an email attachment because you couldn't submit it, you should be able to submit it now. The other thing is I still haven't read all of them, so I'm going to go back and finish reading all of them. And so if I do reject your paper, I'll tell you why I'm rejecting your paper and that I need more content submitted. But if you haven't submitted anything yet, Moodle has been reopened till Sunday night for the chapter 1 and chapter 2.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Are there other questions? Okay, well, I won't leave you in awkward silence, but several of you followed up with me last week and asked to meet for a few minutes so that we could talk about what's next or how to, I think the methods section and particularly the introduction help really bring into focus just how much more narrow the topic needs to be. And so I hope most of you have found that now between last week and this week. But if you're still struggling with that and you want to meet and talk about that individually, just send me an email and I'll set up a few minutes on Zoom that we can talk individually, and I'll help you find that piece that you're looking for. Okay. So last but not least, the big picture is, again, this has to be something that you get some meaningful use out of it. This has to be more than just an exercise where You know, I did those 11 things and the professor gave me a grade. I really hope you get a good experience out of this, that you can, because again, if you wind up in any role at some point in your life where you need to be able to research something, you need to sort out the difference between what's good and what's not so good, and where the best information is. And that's the whole purpose behind this. And this is a really big deal in healthcare. And so I do hope you get something meaningful out of it, rather than just trying to check a box so that you can move on. I know everybody wants to graduate. I want you to graduate, but I also want you to learn something along the way. Last chance. Any questions? Okay, well, I appreciate your time this evening. And again, if you want to spend some time individually, please send me a note and I'll set something up, and we'll meet then. Until that time, I hope you all have a good evening. And right now, actually, I see a chat question. Okay, right now, we'll still plan to meet next Tuesday night, but if something changes, I'll be sure to let you know well before next Tuesday. Okay, you all have a good night.